So your friend asks you, what did you think about their concert or paper presentation or an idea that they just had? And frankly, you're not that impressed. What do? Tell them the truth or spare their feelings with a little white lie? Or how about this scenario? You are working in a group and one member of the group is not contributing and everyone else is working extra to cover for them. What do? Report the supervisor, confront them, or just let it go to avoid any awkward discussions? How about this scenario? There's a conference or a musical event in some other country, say Sweden or Norway, and flying there is quicker and more convenient and probably cheaper, but you know that taking the ferry and the train would be much more environmentally friendly. Do you prioritize efficiency or sustainability? So questions like these arise every day in our lives. Questions about food, transportation, relationships, work, leisure, and more. And some questions demand immediate choices and some demand some deeper reflection. Some decisions seem very trivial and others carry significant implications to us or some other people or maybe to the whole planet. Consider this. On average, what do you think? How many food or beverage related decisions do you make every day? Make a little guess with your neighbor. How many food related decisions do you make each day? What do you think? How many? 1,000, okay, wow. You think about food a lot. Other guesses? 15, 18? Yeah, okay, interesting. So there's a study, apparently, from Cornell University that found that people estimate around 15. And in reality, we make over 200 food-related decisions each day. So why do many people have a tendency to underestimate this number? One reason, of course, is that many of these decisions happen automatically, without conscious awareness. So you step into Aleppo next door, and 5 minutes later you exit with a chocolate bar in your hands. Why? Because you were hungry and you were on autopilot and the chocolate was very conveniently placed near the counter where you paid for your healthy lunch salad. And in most cases, it is because our brains simplify the process. It has been said that we make approximately 35,000 decisions every day. And so our brain is very clever in a way that it simplifies the process so that we can rely on habits and routines and all these subconscious shortcuts. And often it is good so that we don't have to use so much energy in making these decisions. And we follow social conventions such as traffic signals or concert etiquette, and this helps us to streamline our interactions and save us as individuals and groups of people from uncertainty and needless confusion. But as I will suggest today, when ethical considerations are at play, relying solely on rules or routines or norms or acting on autopilot is simply not enough. Ethical decision-making requires deliberation and reflection. So today I will argue that research ethics does not provide fixed answers, but instead presents us with critical questions. And this is perhaps particularly relevant in art-related research where conventional notions of objectivity and knowledge productions are often challenged and incorporating embodied and tacit and experiential dimensions. So to navigate these complexities, we need a framework that extends beyond procedural ethics. And I do not propose replacing the shared norms and procedures and guidelines, quite the contrary. Instead, I aim to outline a framework that better accounts for the contextual and relational and often unpredictable nature of ethical decision-making in research. And by coincidence, my talk will in many ways align with and continue the themes that were raised in yesterday's afternoon speech by Tuulikki Laes and Taru Anneli Koivisto, but I do believe that reflecting on the interplay between procedural and virtue ethics is a topic that can hopefully will withstand one more take. So I will begin by examining some of the shared norms and procedures and guidelines that shape our research practices and also explain why, although they are not sufficient on their own to ensure ethical conduct, I still believe that they remain important and relevant. And then I will broaden the perspective by introducing a virtue ethics approach, highlighting the importance of cultivating habits of ethical deliberation, and then I will finally explore potential of ethics by guided dialogue created by Mustajoki and Mustajoki, and I will propose a way forward in fostering ethical sensitivity grounded in shared responsibility and argue for the importance of making time for careful deliberations as a means to contribute to a flourishing life. So let's begin. Why do we do research in, on, about, or related to arts? Why do we do what we do? Why do you do what you do? What makes good research? What makes a good researcher? Are you a good researcher? What does it mean to you? The answers to these questions clearly depend on the standards and ideals that we use to evaluate various aims and actions and events and choices. And Esa Kirkkopelto yesterday very eloquently examined some of these perspectives in his keynote speech. And on these values, we build our norms, the set of principles, commands, and imperatives that guide us in deciding what to and how to do it. So take social norms, for instance. If you take a look at this place and this setup, we have a set of social norms at play here, and many of our kind of typical Western pedagogies and academic practices are built on those norms. So I'm standing here behind this pulpit and you are comfortably seated there, quite far away from me, and I can't really see your faces. And now it's my turn to speak, and you try to look politely alert, and then it will be your turn to ask me questions, although we all know that often the questions asked are much more valuable than the answers that I can come up with at the moment. But here is how we roll. So we follow these unwritten social norms, and thinking about your own research, you have probably identified already a number of social norms that you consciously or unconsciously apply in different phases of your project. So during your doctoral thesis, you have likely started to notice the differences between institutional and disciplinary norms, for instance, when it comes to how authorship is determined, or what kinds of publishing expectations there is, or whether certain research methods are favored over others, and what etiquette governs peer review. And while social norms are shaped by societal expectations, which are often, of course, tacit and informal and constantly evolving, legal norms are more formal and more rigid and backed by authority. So as researchers, we are expected to adhere to legal norms such as the Finnish Constitution or the European General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. And sometimes a legal norm is also a moral norm, so most people probably would agree that discrimination is not only illegal but also morally unacceptable. But then on the other hand, failing to help a friend in need is not against the law, but it may lead to feelings of guilt or shame or moral disapproval from others maybe. So just as in our everyday life, in research, moral norms provide standards for what one ought or ought not to do. Moral norms are rooted in ethical values, personal conscience, and collective beliefs about justice and fairness and human well-being. They form the foundation of professional ethics, including research ethics. So we ask, what is the right thing to do? Or what should one not do? An example of this is, of course, non-maleficence, the principle of do no harm, a cornerstone of ethical research. So while moral norms form the ethical foundation, procedural ethics conceptualize or operationalize them into concrete policies and structured guidelines and formal processes. Unlike in many other countries, such as Sweden and Norway, for instance, Finland operates under a self-regulation system when it comes to research integrity and ethics, in which the scientific community defines research misconduct and investigates suspicions and imposes sanctions. The system is built on internal regulation of the research community, and it emphasizes openness and transparency and mutual trust between researchers and research institutions. So all research in Finland, as you hopefully know, regardless of discipline and form or methodology, must adhere to the Finnish Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, the so-called HTK-ohje in Finnish. And this aligns with the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity. And here are the guiding principles or fundamental principles that guide these guidelines: reliability, honesty, respect, and accountability. And then beyond these guidelines, those of us who are conducting non-medical research which involves human participants, we must also follow another set of ethical principles, the ethical principles of research with human participants. So if you're, for instance, interviewing or observing or engaging in artistic or pedagogical activities with your research participants, this is a guideline for you. And these principles are they underpin the ethical review processes that are carried out in every university in Finland, including ours. So an ethical review is always conducted before the research begins, and it is by no means always required. But before starting your research, you should determine whether an ethical review is necessary. So, for instance, if your research involves interventions that affect the physical integrity of research participants, or if your research exposes participants to exceptionally strong stimuli, or if your research poses a potential threat to the safety of anyone involved, you definitely need an ethical review. And in the ethical review process, an academic panel, which consists of researchers, provide peer review regarding the planned implementation of the research from the perspective of risk and harm avoidance. So while the ultimate responsibility for ethical conduct lies with the researcher, the committee tries to help to identify potential ethical risks or concerns before they become ethical problems. So the primary goal is to protect both research participants and the researcher by ensuring ethical integrity throughout the study. And if you're not familiar with these guidelines or procedures, you can easily find them online, either at UniArt's website or TENK's website, and I, of course, add all the relevant links here in the slides as well. Okay, but why do we need these guidelines and procedures? Why do they matter? Firstly, because behind procedural ethics lies a history of harm, a history in which real people and real bodies and real communities were deeply harmed. Research ethics principles were not created in a vacuum, but they were established in response to harm. So they were codified in policy and regulation to prevent, or at least mitigate, future injustices. So they help us to consider ways how we could prevent potential harm to research participants and other stakeholders in our research. And lest we forget, the researcher enjoys the freedom of research and exercises epistemic and other forms of power. So this freedom and power position carries out specific ethical responsibilities across all phases of the research process, from the conceptualizations to methodological choices to dissemination and societal engagement. So research integrity is deeply tied to the credibility and reliability of research, to the very question of trust. If you lose that trust by cheating or by being sloppy, you lose the point of doing research, quite simply. However, and now comes the however part. Given the complexity of ethical issues, focusing solely on rules and compliance can only take us so far. If you consider the use of generative artificial intelligence, for instance, when OpenAI launched their ChatGPT in November 2022, one of the first concerns in academia was and continues to be research integrity. Scholars worldwide called for clear normative guidelines and global standards for the use of Gen AI, and I fully support this demand. I think that in a world where political and financial power is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few, I see guidelines such as EU's AI Act as a wonderfully ambitious attempt to uphold shared values that protect human and planetary life. And indeed, universities must establish clear guidelines for researchers on the responsible use of generative AI, and this is a process that we are in this university at the moment. However, ethical questions about AI and data privacy, for example, are evolving remarkably faster than our guidelines. And as you have probably noticed, applying bureaucratic principles in complex real-life situations is difficult, to say at least. What does the principle of reliability, for instance, mean in terms of quality of data and algorithms used by AI tools? Or how can an individual researcher follow the principle of respect and ensure the data used by AI applications is not based on plagiarism, incomplete data, or violation of intellectual property rights? Or consider these questions. What does honesty and accountability look like in a competitive academic culture driven by a publish or perish culture or mentality? Or how can we ensure that participation in research is genuinely voluntary? How do we navigate ethical challenges when Finnish procedures do not translate well in international research contexts? Or how do we address distress or threats when working with contested traditions or politically sensitive topics? I suggest that as much as we need shared guidelines, ethical competence requires the cultivation of ethical sensitivity and practical wisdom in navigating the complex ethical terrain of music research. Let me tell you a little story. So this is a completely fictional story. I made it up with the help of ChatGPT, which also helped me to make this a bit weird picture. So any resemblance to actual research project or people are purely coincidental. So imagine there was a doctoral student, a researcher, who is conducting ethnographic research on vocal pedagogy in a higher music education institution somewhere. And the study focuses on how singing teachers guide students in finding their own voice and how students experience this process. The researcher has secured consent forms from all participants and has been granted permission to observe singing lessons and conduct interviews and analyze recorded performances. So everything is tip-top. This researcher has considered all the things that has to be done. But during the interviews, the researcher notices that some students hesitate when answering questions about their vocal identity, and they seem somehow reluctant to talk or to critique their teacher's methods. And during observations, the researcher witnesses emotionally intense moments between a student and their teacher. The student shares personal struggles affecting their voice, including anxiety and past experiences of vocal criticism. And then there's one participant, while discussing their vocal journey, reveals that they have struggled with self-esteem due to past vocal training experiences, and they become visibly distressed in the interview situation. And as it happens, the doctoral researcher is also a part-time vocal instructor at the institution, and some students participating in the study are aware of this and express concerns about how their responses might influence their future opportunities. What kind of ethical questions did you identify, if any? Maybe there were some that were related to transparency, confidentiality, participant well-being maybe, power dynamics, trust and responsibilities. And now let's imagine that our researcher wants to act in an ethically sustainable way. So they take the ethical questions very seriously. But soon they realize that the available ethical guidelines do not offer clear answers on how to navigate them. So this scenario highlights an important reality. Ethical considerations in research often extend beyond mere compliance with formal guidelines. So how would you advise the researcher what to do? What if we change our perspective at this point? So instead of focusing solely on moral obligations or consequences, we shift our attention to the ethical agent, the person who is making moral judgments. So rather than asking, what rule should I follow? We ask, what does it mean to be a good or an excellent or a virtuous researcher in this setting? In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argues that virtues such as courage, justice, and trustworthiness are skills or qualities of character that develop and become perfected through practice. Just as one learns to sing by singing, so too does one cultivate virtue through action. We become just by doing just acts, Aristotle writes. But as with learning to play an instrument or mastering a craft, not just any kind of action will lead to excellence. The quality of our actions matters. So a good builder becomes skilled not simply by building, but by building well. And we know this, of course, as musicians and music pedagogues. It does matter how you practice, not just that you practice 10 minutes a day. And the same applies to researcher. A good researcher is someone who has cultivated habits of thinking and acting that allow them to discern what is appropriate in each situation. In this sense, virtue can be understood as a deeply ingrained quality of a person, a tendency for the person to be a certain way, as philosopher Julia Annas puts it. In their article on ethical considerations related to research about school music teaching, music education researchers Cecilia Björk and Maria-Lena Juntunen points out that ethical questions in research are not only about good behavior, but also about understanding how and why certain decisions make research ethically excellent. Such decisions are not arbitrary, rather they are aligned with what it means to be the kind of a researcher whose professional work contributes to a good life for others. Okay, so these are big words. What could this mean in practice? Let's take the beginning of a research process as an example. So at that stage, pursuing ethical excellence could involve, for instance, that the researcher actively identifies and anticipates potential ethical questions within their project and makes informed decisions about how to proceed in various situations based on that analysis. And if an ethical review is required, then this kind of ethical reflection becomes a very key part of that process. But I strongly recommend that even when you don't need an ethical review, this kind of reflective thinking already at the outset of your project could be highly beneficial. So rather than relying on vague statements like, I will carefully follow ethical principles and guidelines by TENK or whatever, it is often much more useful to view the project from the perspective of the participant and other stakeholders. So you could ask yourself, for instance, how can I ensure that participants do not feel pressured or obliged to take part, especially if you are in some kind of power position like the teacher, for instance? What kind of recruitment process supports equal representation? Who has the narrative control? Who gets to tell the story? Whose voice is excluded or included? And why? How will I safeguard the well-being of the participants and myself? How can I take into account the emotional burden of research? How do we handle sensitive or distressing topics, for instance? How can I design the data generation process, international collaboration and or dissemination of results to reduce their environmental footprints? Try to be as practical and as concrete as you can. Consider available resources, your chosen ways of working, the language you use, maybe the visual design of the format, information sheets. Consider whether there might be a need for external support, physical or mental. How about the location of the interviews, and so on and so forth. So all these seemingly small but and kind of practical decisions can and often do carry ethical significance. They invite the researcher to reflect on their choices beyond merely complying the rules. In other words, to engage in thoughtful and sensitive and responsible practice at every step of the way. So a virtue ethics approach invites us to ask a fundamental question. Do my ethical choices bring me closer to or further away from a good life and virtuous conduct? At its heart, this is a question about how we should relate to others. And by others, I mean our fellow human beings and our fellow non-human beings and the biosphere. Even the most carefully planned research project will inevitably present new and unexpected ethical questions. So an ethical review is an excellent starting point, but it is not enough. Researchers must go beyond formal approval and engage in ongoing ethical reflection throughout the entire research process. So returning to our fictional story I told, imagine the researcher trying to decide, so now they have collected the data and all that, so now they're trying to decide what to highlight in their study. So on the one hand, exposing problems and tensions in teaching could, over time, contribute to improving educational practices. And on the other hand, focusing too heavily on difficulties may increase participants' fears of negative consequences or amplify anxiety about matters that they have little power to change. So it could also inadvertently damage the reputation of teachers maybe or the institution. So as reminded by Björk and Juntunen, research ethics is not detached from human relationships. How we relate to our participants or our colleagues matters just as much as research integrity itself. Thus, our researcher in this little story is faced with the question of how to balance truthfulness with respect and care. And I believe that each research process offers an opportunity to grow into a better researcher, not only in terms of technical skills and methods and communication, as important as those are, but also in our capacity to navigate complex and contradictory and unexpected situations. And this growth helps cultivate habits of mind and action that allow us to discern what is appropriate in each unique context. So how do we, as researchers, promote a good life? How do we contribute to improving rather than worsening conditions through our work? And what does reliability and honesty and respect or accountability, these four principles, mean in ethically sensitive situations? Of course, there's no simple rule or universal guideline that could tell us that, sadly. So I turn to Aristotle again, who reminds us that virtue is found in the balance between two extremes. So if you think about a continuum and say we take a virtue of courage, it's good to be courageous as a researcher. So at the other end you have recklessness. So you don't want to be recklessly bold, rushing into risks without any reflection. And on the other end of the continuum you would have kind of being fearful. So you don't want to be too fearful, avoiding difficult issues simply to stay safe or avoid discomfort or awkward conversations, for instance. So somewhere in the middle of the continuum lies the virtue of courage. A good researcher exercises judgment to determine what kind of action is most appropriate in a given situation. And this calls for practical wisdom, phronesis, a virtue in itself that enables us to weigh the different factors and anticipate potential consequences and consider the broader impact of our choices. So applying this kind of practical wisdom, we move beyond rigid rules and instead respond to ethical challenges in ways that are balanced and context sensitive and humane. So ultimately, this is about contributing to a world where knowledge and arts and research could support human and planetary flourishing, or as the ancient thinkers called it, eudaimonia, the condition of living a good and meaningful life. Now, it would be tempting to stop here with this uplifting thought, but I'd like to continue just a little bit longer and try to dig a little bit deeper. I just used the concept of flourishing, and I feel that it deserves some unpacking. Because flourishing has become something of a buzzword of our time, and increasingly it is framed as an individual achievement. And I don't know how you just heard it, whether you felt like, oh, one more box to tick, something that I must strive for and attain. And in this framing, flourishing is often reduced to personal success or self-optimization, with little or no reference to social, ethical, or communal responsibility. And this is kind of a neoliberal or self-help logic, and according to that logic, a flourishing researcher might be someone who has landed a position and meets performance metrics in both quantity and quality of publications and displays grit and resilience in the face of competition and experiences deep personal satisfaction and happiness. But this interpretation, where flourishing is equated primarily with personal happiness and a subjective well-being or self-fulfillment, distorts Aristotle's original conception of eudaimonia, which emphasizes the ethical and communal dimension of a good life. And moreover, it also risks reinforcing the dehumanizing and individualistic values that increasingly shape academic life. In such a context, even ethical excellence becomes yet another personal objective to pursue, another box to tick, rather than something that grows out of meaningful relationships, shared responsibilities, and collective reflection. So, in conclusion, I would like to propose two things. First, rather than viewing research ethics as an individual virtue project, a kind of moral self-improvement journey, I invite us to consider how we might move towards a more dialogic model. And second, I want to emphasize the importance of making time for reflection. A helpful way to approach ethics as a collective process is through the framework of ethics by guided dialogue, developed by researchers Henrikka Mustajoki and Arto Mustajoki. The term dialogue in this model encourages us to see ethics as a collaborative and reflective practice, one that focuses on identifying ethical questions before they escalate into ethical problems. At the heart of this approach is the idea that ethical reasoning should be explicit, transparent, and dialogic. It requires continuous reflection and shared discussion rather than isolated decision-making. It is shaped and strengthened through thoughtful engagement with the research community. And the term guided in this approach refers to the use of a structured toolbox of ethical reasoning skills. By applying this kind of approach, researchers can make choices that are not only better justified, but also transparent and grounded in clear reasoning. And this framework helps ethical decision makers ask a broad range of meaningful questions. Questions that clarify the situation, bring multiple perspectives into dialogue, and support more justifiable and inclusive outcomes. And here are some examples of what these questions could look like. For instance, what ethical questions arise in this particular situation? So this is about identifying what are the ethical questions that are at play. Who are the stakeholders? This is about identifying who all my research has some direct or indirect implications. What responsibilities do I have as a researcher? And what are the possible ways forward? Maybe there's more than one. Or maybe there's a way that you haven't thought, but your colleagues could think of. So importantly, our answers to these questions will reveal underlying values and goals and contextual considerations. And this process of increased transparency and collective reasoning doesn't just help us make better decisions individually, it also contributes to building a stronger and more cohesive research community, I believe. As I have suggested, ethics is not a one-time approval. Rather, it is a continuous, evolving process of reflection, and one that is inherently collaborative. Ethical sensitivity and practical wisdom are essential for fostering integrity in research, They help us navigate the uncertain, the uncomfortable, and the unexpected. Music education researcher Danielle Tracy offers an honest and insightful account of what she calls situations of breakdown, those moments of the research process when something causes the researcher to stumble. And drawing on Barrett and Stauffer, Tracy reminds us of the value of such moments. She highlights the disquiet, the instance of unsettling, and the recognition of certainties troubled as precisely the times and spaces where insight takes root. So in this way, a stumble is not necessarily a setback. It can become an invitation to stay unbalanced just a little bit longer than is comfortable. Because, as Brinkman puts it, this is where we may learn something new. But this kind of learning takes time. It often requires patience and perhaps most of all courage to resist the urge to move on too quickly and instead to stay with the discomfort. It calls also for intentional dialogue. As Tracy points out, we must let the situation teach us by generating knowledge together through conversation that seeks to understand the perspectives, motivations, and choices of others. So, to conclude, in this speech I have argued that research ethics does not provide fixed answers, but it offers critical questions that challenge us to reflect and take responsibility. And while ethical excellence does not mean always having the answers, let alone having them immediately, it is something that we can cultivate. And this means moving beyond rule following to ask, what does it mean to be a good researcher? As Iris Murdoch reminds us, ethics is not only about what is right to do, but also about what is good to be. And this moral vision is not formed in isolation. It grows in dialogue, in community. So in an academic world that is driven by speed and performance and competition often, how could we make room for slowness and reflection? Taking time to pause, to question, to engage in dialogue, I think it should not be a luxury. Instead, it should be an essential key thing that we do here if we want to work to contribute to the flourishing of others and not just our own careers. So ethical excellence is not about avoiding risks or never making mistakes. It is a shared journey, shaped by uncertainty, sustained by reflection, and nurtured through dialogue. How could we create open and trusting environments where researchers can speak honestly about ethical uncertainties and dilemmas? To move toward a research culture that values ethical sensitivity, not just as a personal trait, but as a shared commitment. A commitment that shapes how we think, how we act, and how we relate to one another in our scholarly work. And then flourishing, I don't think it's an individual goal to reach. Rather, I see it as an ongoing ethical journey, a way of being that is rooted in care and responsibility and shared inquiry. So with these thoughts, I thank you very much.